Okay, why has it happened? There are many different ideas on why it's happened. So one is the minimum wage. We'll talk about each one of these in turn, but one of them is going to blame a significant amount of the rise in inequality on the minimum wage, on the falling real minimum wage. Another is going to blame it on skill-biased technological change in superstars. There are plenty of papers on this. The one I don't have right now is by, but I should add, is by Danny Yagan. I'm going to talk about Danny Yagan, Owen Zadar, and Eric Zwick, Capitalists in the 21st Century. But skill-biased technological change is going to be one of them. I'm going to lump their paper in that. They might not agree. Other people are going to blame it on tax rates. We'll talk about that. Ill-gotten profiteering and rent-seeking, like finance, blaming finance and CEOs. And then some people are going to say the degree of our measured increase in income inequality has been overstated. Okay, great. So we're going to look at each one of those in turn. I'm not going to be the referee and say, here's who wins. I'm going to give you a flavor of why, Steve Levitt, if you take his crime class, for instance, I assume he'll still say that I think it was in the paper, a JEL article, we explain, 200% of the decrease in crime in the 1990s. And why? It's because you have a bunch of papers, each explaining 20% of the decrease in crime. Well, then you kind of add them all up, we've over-explained decrease in crime. It's going to be like that for income inequality. We are not going to have a shortage of explanations for the increase in income inequality. So in that sense, each one we're going to see is going to be like, we can explain like 70% of the increase. Okay, great, 50 to 70% of the increase. So let's talk about the minimum wage. This is from a paper by Card and DiNardo. You can easily find it if you're interested. That looks at the real minimum wage from 1973 to 2000. As you can see, the real minimum wage falls. What happens to fitted wage inequality as measured by the 90-10 wage gap? Well, it turns out that what you would predict from the minimum wage exactly mirrors the falling minimum wage, exactly mirrors what you get out of the 90-10 wage gap. So it turns out it doesn't have as good a fit post-2000, but this is like a perfect explanation in terms of, wow, the minimum wage fell and the 90-10 income ratio dramatically increased. Maybe a lot of the fall for that bottom 50% or the bottom 25%, which makes up the bottom 50%, and so is significant for it, is coming from a fall in the minimum wage. There are other papers, hopefully I'll show them in a little bit, that show the same thing for Brazil. Brazil had a significant minimum wage increase, it like doubled in a course of a few years, and the standard deviation of wages in Brazil fell dramatically. So there is reason to think the minimum wage plays a role in income inequality. Surprising to some people. Second explanation, this is almost a bromide of inequality talks, is so-called skill-biased technological change. So the idea here is that capital may be more complementary or less substitutable with high-skilled labor than with low-skilled labor. So this is reminiscent of what we talked about for immigration when we said, maybe immigrants are substitutes for other immigrants, or relatively more complementary with natives and super complementary with high-skilled natives. Low-skilled immigrants may be super complementary with high-skilled natives, that sort of thing. That's going to be the idea, but with capital. So capital could be particularly more complementary with high-skilled labor than with low-skilled labor. It could replace low-skilled labor, like an immigrant might replace a low-skilled native. Not necessarily the case, as we saw, that's the idea, but complement a high-skilled native in CES production function. So that's the core of this skill-biased technological change. Maybe computers have gotten better, maybe technology has changed in a way that's biased towards high-skilled people, complementary toward them, while replacing low-skilled people, which is going to exacerbate the wage gap. So as you see, the share of IT and GDP has gone up dramatically. Computer use and work has gone up dramatically. This is from Card and DiNardo. So what they do is they take what other people do, Otter, Katz, and Kearney, is take a very cool model by Larry Katz and Kevin Murphy, which basically is kind of the supply and demand model of inequality. And it just takes the CS production function basically and says how much of the wage gap can we explain with relative supply and demand, and time trend. So you can think of this as like how much does supply and demand. High skilled people are in higher and higher in higher and higher demand due to skill-based technological change. They may be relatively scarce. That's going to drive up their wages. And so let's measure the quantities of low skilled and high skilled people. Let's measure their wage gap and see how much of it can we explain. And what a kind of a supply and demand type model would predict is the dashed line. And what the actual data is the solid line. I can't do this, but solid line. And what you end up getting is that, hey, if you're trying to understand the college high school wage gap, you'll notice this is not the 90-10 wage gap, but it's going to play a role in the professional class versus the bottom 50%, for instance. What we would expect from supply and demand is that wage gap, so 0.75 would be a 75% wage increase relative to high school educated people. We would expect we would over-explain the increase in income inequality. Income inequality measured by the college to high school wage gap has not risen as much as we would think if we were just looking at skill-based technological change. So this makes skill-based technological change a contender for understanding why income inequality has risen. And in fact, it thinks income inequality, the puzzle is why it hasn't risen more. In at least this simple paper. I encourage you to read it because it's kind of cool. One of the coolest new papers that came out last year, although it's been a working paper for a while, is the paper I cited by Yagan, Zwick, and Zadar and Zwick. And they're going to look at pass-through income. So the idea here is, why is the top 1%'s income share risen? Well, some of that's just been, they have more capital income, they have more salaries, great. So they're just richer, right? But a significant fraction of that increase since 1980 is their share has risen precipitously, right? But a significant rise, so it's gone up by 10, as I say here, 10.1 percentage points since 1980. So they've gained a lot. That's the sort of graph we saw earlier. How much of that has been due to salaries and other capital income? 60% of it, but 40% of it has been due to this other thing, pass-through income, where basically you own your money, my money as a rich person, is coming through my business. It's not coming to me in the form of a salary that I'm paying taxes on. It's not coming to me as a form of a dividend because I own some corporation. It's just coming to me because I own a business, essentially. And a significant fraction of the rise in top incomes, the top 1%'s income, has been due to an increase in pass-through income, pass-through business income. It goes from the business to me. And that's kind of puzzling. They say, okay, why could that be? Why have I put this in kind of a skill-based technological change framework? They may disagree. But the idea here is that we caricature the top 1% as fat cats and rentiers. So certainly what I thought before I read this paper is that they must get most of their income through capital income. What Yagan, Zadar, and Zwick do is ask where they're earning their money from. So they use one of these big IRS data sets from 2001 to 2014. And they look, excuse me, at a whole bunch of businesses in the United States. And it's going to turn out that a significant, as we saw in the last graph, a significant fraction of the top 1%, 69% of the top 1%, and 84% of the top 0.1% earn pass-through income. So what is this? So the top 1% professional statuses with pass-through income are going to be people like consultants, lawyers, specialty tradespeople, and single establishment service firms. So this is going to be like consultants or something, physicians and dentists, right? Those, when you're trying to figure out who the top 1% are who are in this pass-through income category, and the pass-through income category is fairly large, it's going to be those guys. You're trying to figure out who the top 0.1% are. It's going to be things like their modal person is a regional business with about $20 million in sales and about 100 employees. So this is like an auto dealer, a beverage distributor, or a large law firm. Those are the guys who are the top 1%, 0.1%, who are getting pass-through income. So why is any of this relevant? Well, a significant number of the top 1%, top 0.1% are earning via their labor, not through capital. So in some sense, when I see some guy working in his business and getting a whole bunch of money, I could say, oh, well, this is due to, capital. He's a fat cat, right? He just owns his business and does nothing. Okay. And this couldn't be skill-biased technological change because he's not that much more productive. So what they do, which is incredibly clever, is they look at non-elderly owners who die and who had earned at least $1 million in their business before death. So they're going to say, hey, let's look at all these businesses. So the claim is, all those guys are fat cats, right? They're producing nothing. So what they do is they look at those guys and look at people who suddenly died. Sudden die is just people who aren't old. So nobody saw this coming. So you don't necessarily have a successor in place who's already been trained, et cetera. What they see is that firm profits fall by 75%. So the implication of this is that in their brains, somewhere in their brains and in their labor, they are contributing 75% of the profits to the firm, which is not insignificant. So what they're going to do is say, this is a real deal. This is when I say this is a real deal. This is human capital. And human capital is important for understanding income inequality. And we've seen half of the rise in income inequality is due to pass-through income. And we have strong evidence that pass-through income is really labor income. Even though it's business income, it's really coming from labor. At least 75% of it is coming from something we think of as labor/human capital. And I say human capital. This may include my ability to talk to clients, my ability to schmooze or whatever people do or in law firms. So what they're going to do is add 75% of pass-through income to wages and see where people get their money. And this fiscal income, they have different definitions of income. But it's going to turn out, when you're in the bottom, you're a poor person in the bottom 90th percentile, you're getting most of it from labor income. Sorry. If you look at the faded line, you would think, oh, they're all fat cats. Once you get to the 99.9 percentile, the 100th percentile, those guys are only getting 40% of it through wages. But if you recognize that most of pass-through income is actually coming through because of labor, then you think that, most of those guys, 75% of their income, 99.9 percentile to 100th percentile income is actually coming from labor rather than from being a fat cat. So this has rocked the world of inequality research, this paper, I think with good reason, because it challenges what I would have thought before, this idea that these guys are earning most of their income, essentially 100% of their income, I would have thought, through capital income, turns out to not be right, or at least they have evidence that it may not be right. Okay, what are some other explanations? We've seen minimum wage. We've seen skill-biased technological change. What about tax rates? This is a cool one. Thomas Piketty, Manuel Saez, and Stephanie Stancheva did a very cool paper where they said, and just to be clear, so we're going to say a significant fraction of income inequality could be explained by minimum wages, can be explained by skill-biased technological change. What Piketty says, and Stancheva are going to say is, let's look at the change in the top marginal tax rate across countries and change in the top 1% share and say, how much of this is due to taxes? They say, hey, look, the line fits this pretty well. The United States is, in fact, I think, right on this line. And as a consequence, we can explain 100% of the US 1% rise in income share. Their top marginal tax rate fell by 47% or whatever, and their top 1% share grew by 9%. Game over, man. It's due to tax rates. We dropped tax rates in 1987, among other times, and their income share rose. It's pretty straightforward, right? So that's yet another explanation. Minimum wage, skill-biased technological change, tax rates, yet another explanation. What about finance and CEO pay? So finance has grown from 2.8% of GDP in 1950 to 4.9% in 1980 to 8.3% of its peak in 2006. That's a pretty strong growth in terms of GDP. Similarly, from 1978 to 2000, CEO pay rose by 1,279%. Interesting fact, it actually fell over the next 12 years. If you're interested why, the basic idea is there's evidence that firms did not understand how boards of directors did not understand how options worked, did not understand that they were is essentially like printing money They could print money and give stock options to people, but that diluted current shareholders. It's going to like cause inflation in the stock price, i.e., make it worth less. And I've talked to CEOs who have not understood this. So there's reason to think that they didn't understand that. We changed the accounting rules so that they had to recognize the true cost of options, and suddenly CEO pay started decreasing. I mean, I'm not going to blame it all on that, but it's remarkable to me, the CEO pay peaked around 2000, and then we changed GAAP accounting rules or whatever. Okay, great. But this increase is still large. I mean, you can't increase by 1,000% and then decrease by 29% is, not that much. They're still up 700% or whatever. But when you look at increase in top 1%, top 0.1%, they're typically driven by people with either executive in their title or who are in the financial sector. Great. So this might be a concern to many finance and CEOs. You might think these are largely parasitical. So for instance, active mutual funds underperform compared to passive benchmarks, even before fees on average. This is Fama. We can talk about this in discussions if you want, but Fama and French 2010. That's bad. That's bad. Why is finance getting so much money if they're mutual funds at least are bad at their jobs? That would be the line of argument. Similarly, if you look at the dot-com bust or financial crisis, you could even ask, is finance's contribution positive? I think there's evidence that it is, but I think I'll talk about that later. But that's a concern, right? These finance guys are getting they're making up an enormous amount of this. Why are they getting so much money? If you look at CEO pay to wages, it's clear that CEO pay to top wages have increased even above and beyond what you would expect. So if these guys are high human capital, then why are we even seeing their increase above and beyond high human capital or to top incomes? So it's clear that CEO pay has even outpaced top incomes. That's the sort of thing people are concerned about. These are survey articles that are very easy to read if you find them. So that's going to be another piece of the puzzle is why has income inequality risen? Maybe it's minimum wages. There are other explanations of fall of unions that I won't talk about, but fall of unions, the tax rates, skill-based technological change. What we just saw, finance and CEO pay has increased for some reason. And another argument is that it hasn't actually risen that much. So this sort of paper, this genre of paper will say, we're measuring income inequality wrong. And I'm actually not going to talk about the big way in which we think Sayers and Zuckman et al., the World Inequality Database is overstating the change in income inequality. But broadly speaking, if you just take like the CPS, the Current Population Survey, and you say, well, what's happened pre-tax, pre-transfer, then bottom 50% income is only increased by 3.2%, right? As you go to sorry, I didn't label all the columns, but all I'm going to care about here is as you go to a post-tax, post-transfer, and include health insurance. So the idea here is more of the bottom 50% have private health insurance now, and the cost of private health insurance has risen precipitously, and their employers are paying that on their behalf. So as a consequence, if you count that as part of their compensation, they're certainly getting the benefit of that private health insurance. Now, maybe it's all waste, something like that. But if you count the amount their employer is paying on their behalf, then their wages are going up by, instead of essentially nothing per year, about 1% per year. So this is the flavor of the sort of paper that would say, well, what if we measure it more carefully and so on? We're going to see Bruce Meyer does an even better job of this later. Okay, so the takeaways for the subsection, takeaways for the subsection are that there are multiple competing explanations. And I'm not going to, all of them explain, 100% of the rise, I say facetiously. It could be the minimum wage. I didn't say unions, but the unions have a similar story as the minimum wage. They may have held up the bottom end among earners. There's no doubt, I think, among anybody's mind, that technological change explains a significant amount of the rise in income inequality. Just it's hard to explain the top 0.001% this rise in income share from higher human capital. Potentially possible. As we saw, it depends on how you define human capital. But if somebody who's just a good beverage distributor can find out the holes in the market or whatever, and is in that top 0.1%, because again, the beverage distributors are the modal guy, representative guy in Zdarswyk and Yagin's paper. That may be human capital. I'm not a beverage distributor. I don't know. But it's not horribly unreasonable to think that, I think, would be the claim. It's worth noting, however, as we'll see in a second, accounting for tax and transfer is going to mitigate a good bit of the absolute increase in inequality. We'll see that in a minute. But finance and CEO pay is increased. It's not clear if this is superstars or scale and superstars and scale or corruption. So that's where we'll break for now. Then we'll talk about what can and can't be done about it soon.